So now let's look at our examples that we started with. Not just a squirrel, but a flying squirrel has the binomial Glaucomys volans. That is the unique name that's going to describe this particular animal. When we look at something like the rock squirrel, you can see that it's a much different binomial, Spermophilus variegatus. And what's interesting about these names is what they actually mean. And so Glaucomys refers to the eyes of the flying squirrel. And if you go back, you can see just how large they are. And volans has to do with that movement that they use. In Spermophilus variegatus, variegatus means variation in color, having a variated color. So here we see gray with the white tips and striping to them. The variation in color. Spermophilus literally translates to mean seed or nut loving. And so when you think about what squirrels live on and what their life is built around, they love seeds, they hoard seeds, they cache seeds, they put them away, save them for winter. And so that's what the name of this particular genus of squirrel is going to be. Here we see the 13-line ground squirrel, which is also in this same genus, Spermophilus, but here the species name Tridecim linatus describes this particular animal. Trideci, 3, 10 line, 13-lined squirrel. And so that name tells you precisely what animal we're talking about. And it doesn't matter if you're in the US or you're in Norway or if you're in Brazil or Portugal. Everywhere you go, this animal will be referred to by the same name. And so it doesn't matter where you are studying a particular organism, anyone else in the world can identify exactly what specimen or what species that you're talking about. And so it just enhances clarity, particularly in scientific research. Now here we have a comparison of Spermophilus species, and so we can abbreviate looking at members of the same genus with the SPP abbreviation. That tells us we're looking at multiple species within the genus Spermophilus. And again, as we looked at before, in a comparative study, we abbreviate that genus name with an uppercase S period, and then we have the species name lined out so that we can refer to them as we go along. Now, let's look at our levels of taxonomy a little bit closer. We'll be looking at now the broadest level of taxonomy, which is the domain level. And so in the domain level, we see that there are 3 major lineages. We have the eubacteria, which are the true bacteria up here, and we've talked about the eubacteria and how prolific they are. We have domain archaea, which are the extremophiles that we discussed, those that like to live in extremely hot or extremely salty places, or even in your intestines where there's no oxygen and they're just happy, hunky-dory down there. And then the one we'll be focusing on for the rest of the semester is domain eukarya. These are the eukaryotic organisms, or those that have a true nucleus in all of their cells. Members of domain eubacteria and domain archaea are both made of prokaryotic cells, and so that's a major distinction between these two groups. Now, whenever we look in domain eukarya, we see that there are 4 different groups that are represented here. And so we've talked about the domains of life. Now we're going to focus on the kingdoms of life. The kingdoms are found within the domains. And so up here at the top, we have the protists, which were formerly classified as one kingdom, but that since has been reevaluated, and there are more than 12 kingdoms right now that make up the protists. This is a group that is constantly changing, and it has to do with improvements in our technology that's allowed for greater understanding. We also have kingdom plantae, which are where our photosynthetic autotrophs are going to be. Kingdom fungi, which are where our heterotrophic organisms are going to be found. And then kingdom animalia, also heterotrophs, but multicellular and capable of locomotion. And so we'll talk about these different groups as we go. So we've made it through the domains, we've talked about the kingdoms, but now let's talk about what a species actually is and focus more specifically on that. And so the species is the fundamental unit of classification, but the problem with the species and just kind of thinking about this idea and postulating is, okay, well, where is that dividing line? Well, the dividing line between what one species is and how it's separate from another comes from what's called the biological species concept. The biological species concept was developed in 1982 by a man named Ernst Mayr, and he said that a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed. They have to be able to reproduce or make babies in order to be considered a species. And remember, those babies have to be like them. So we can't just have interbreeding individuals. We see hybrids all the time, but those babies have to be viable and fertile. So a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. Okay? That's the biological species concept. Now, where do new species come from? Well, we see that new species, or speciation, which is the formation of new species, occurs when there is some separation between these groups. And so they have to be reproductively isolated in order to create a new species. Speciation is the formation of a new species that happens whenever a new land bridge develops, separating oceanic populations, or they become isolated in a portion of their habitat. Maybe water dries up between two ponds. Something happens that's going to isolate our populations, making it impossible for them to interbreed. And so as the two groups are no longer allowed to interbreed, now they're inbreeding with each other. And so we're going to see mutations become more common and separations in those genetic lines. And so let's talk about examples of reproductive isolation. And so here we see two birds that look very similar to one another, but I promise you they are different species. Here you have the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark. And even though these two birds look very similar, it'd be hard for me to tell that they weren't one of my species, and they're found in the same areas, their ranges actually overlap. What we see is that they will not interbreed with one another. And that's because of their behaviors. And so if I'm going to go ahead and click on this, and you can click at home, but I'm going to let you listen to the calls of these different birds. And so here we go. Okay, so there's one. And so that's the western meadowlark. And so if you know anything about birds, or you've listened to birds before, you know that they are incredibly specific about their calls. Because their songs are so distinct from one another, that is not going to be attracted to mates, potential mates of the opposite species. And so that's going to keep them from interbreeding. Now, there are multiple types of reproductive isolation. We have some that are going to be pre-zygotic isolation mechanisms. These are those that occur before fertilization takes place. So pre-zygotic means before the zygote forms, or before fertilization. When we look at types of pre-zygotic isolation, we see that first we start with geographic isolation. Geographic isolation is isolation that results from some physical barrier in the environment. And so here we see a mountain range that is separating. So here's the Rocky Mountains coming down through Canada and into the United States. Well, the Rocky Mountains, not that big of a deal to maybe bighorn sheep or bears that can move and traverse that particular boundary, or even plants that can distribute their pollen. But if you're a tiny white-footed mouse, like these two guys, here you have a species, subspecies nebraskanensis and artemisiae, that range of mountains is enough to keep interbreeding from occurring. And so geographic isolation is isolation that's going to result from some physical barrier presenting movement between those two groups. Another interesting example of geographic isolation has to do with antelope squirrels found on the rim of the Grand Canyon. Historically, there was one population of antelope squirrels that were able to move across the Colorado River, which eventually cut through the canyon. But as the river cut more and the Grand Canyon got deeper and deeper and deeper, those populations became isolated, limited interbreeding, and now that geographic barrier has resulted in two distinct species of antelope squirrels on the rim of the Grand Canyon. Our second example is ecological isolation. In ecological isolation, our organisms are going to occupy different parts of the habitat. So when you compare an arboreal lizard to one that spends its whole life crawling around on the sand, and arboreal means it lives its whole life up in the trees, the chances of these two coming in contact with one another in order to reproduce is not going to happen. This guy's never going to leave the trees because that's where he's adapted to live. That's where his food source is. That's where his nest site's going to be. Likewise, this ground dweller, he's got burrows in the sand. He's going to be moving from shrub to shrub. They're not going to come in contact and reproduce. Temporal isolation has to do with isolation based on time or when they're receptive for mating. And so depending on where the species is located, we see that eastern species, like this eastern spotted skunk here, typically become receptive for copulation and mating much earlier in the year than do western species. And that just allows them to have more time to rear their babies before winter sets in and they're forced with dealing with those conditions. So temporal isolation based on time. My favorite one is behavioral isolation, and the birds do it better than any other group. This is isolation that's going to be dependent on performing some sort of mating ritual or courtship ritual. And so here you see the blue-footed boobies, and I would encourage you to Google the dance of the blue-footed boobies and understand that mates are looking for individuals that can perform this particular dance, this courtship ritual, appropriately. Those that don't or have poor genetic indicators, their feet aren't blue enough, for example, will be turned away from mating, or they won't be successful at mating with that particular individual. Other examples include the frigate birds, the albatrosses, the swans, and eagles even that dance in the sky. And so please take some time to look at all of those and learn more about how important behavior is to reproduction in birds. Mechanical isolation is isolation in which the parts don't match up, and so we can align gamete-producing structures for the exchange, which would result in fertilization. So here you see two species of snail. They differ in one gene, which is going to turn their shells in opposite direction. Doesn't seem like a big deal until you realize what those arrows are pointing to are their gametopores, or the pores where their gametes are produced. And so because their shells go in opposite direction, they can't get those lined up without somebody turning over. And so when they can't get their gametopores lined up, they're never going to be able to exchange their gametes for fertilization to occur. All right, so mechanical parts and pieces don't line up. Now we'll move on to post-zygotic isolation mechanisms. These are those that occur after fertilization or after the formation of the zygote. What we're going to see is that these mechanisms will act on the hybrid, or the organism that's produced that contains genes from parents of different species. Okay. And so there's three types of post-zygotic isolation mechanisms we'll look at. The first is hybrid inviability. Essentially, the hybrid doesn't develop, and typically these will be lost before they are born or they're fully matured. They're just kind of the runts that don't do so well. Hybrid sterility is one that many people are familiar with. This is what results in the offspring are sterile, and so they're not going to be able to produce another generation after themselves. And so probably the most familiar example is that of the mule. A mule results from the mating between a horse and the donkey. And while mules are very much viable offspring, they lack that fertility. And so that's what's going to keep the horse and donkey separate, and the mule as an inviable species. You never see herds of wild mules grazing across the plains, and that's because they can't reproduce. Generally, there are exceptions, but again, they're few, they're far between. They all have to do with meiosis. Feel free to look those up, but generally our mules are sterile. I would encourage you to look up other examples of hybrid sterility, including the liger, L-I-G-E-R, the jaglion, which is a cross between a jaguar and a lion, the tigon, the tiger-lion cross. There's a number of different examples of hybrid sterility, particularly in the cat family and also in horses, that I would encourage you to go ahead and take a look at and just kind of familiarize yourself with, because it's interesting. So fun Google searches.